Hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. For tonight's Artist Talk, we have Jill Frank, one of our 2015-16 Working Artist Project Award Fellows. This round of the Working Artist Project was curated by Saisha Grayson, Assistant Curator at the Elizabeth A. Sackler Center for Feminist Art, Brooklyn Museum in New York. This is an important program that we are so proud of, is supported in large by a grant from the Charles Lordens Foundation, with additional funding from the National Endowment of the Arts and Binders Art Supplies. Jill was born in Atlanta, but was raised in Louisville, Kentucky, and currently lives and works here in Atlanta. She received a BA in photography in 2001 from Bard College and an MFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago in 2006. Her work has shown nationally and internationally, and selected solo exhibitions include the Golden Gallery in Chicago and the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago. Her work has been featured in art papers, and reviews of her work have appeared in Art Forum as of, 2 hours ago? Which is wonderful, of this exhibition. The Paris Review and Bad at Sports. Jill relocated from Chicago to Atlanta in 2011 to teach photography at Georgia State University, and now we are lucky to host her exhibition, Nothing Ventured, Nothing Gained. And I'd like to turn things over to the artist herself. Everybody please give a warm welcome to Jill Frank.
Hello. It's working? This is great. Okay, this is my first time with a mic, so be nice. Be nice. So I thought tonight what we would do, just to keep things short, since it is a mostly standing talk, that I would sort of give you guys a little bit of context for the different things that went into this exhibition. And then we could kind of hang out where the chairs are and have some question and answer afterwards. Okay. So this show is a combination of a lot of different ideas, and maybe you could say smaller projects that went into a larger project that I'm calling Nothing Ventured, Nothing Gained in this exhibition. But, you know, I've been working on this particular idea for 3 years easily, and editing for the show could have gone any number of ways. And I'm really happy with the way it went, but it was a surprise. So in this exhibition, there's, there are pictures of people drinking, there are pictures of people before and after different sort of chaotic events happen. And in any one of those scenarios, I could have made, say, the whole show just people shotgunning beers, or just people playing games, or something like that. But the project started actually with this series, this young woman posing, and a young man over there posing. Both of them were ostensibly posing for pictures for other people. They were in vacation spots and having their picture taken. And so I sort of began the project thinking a lot along the lines of a romance project I had done a few years earlier, which was very much about how we position ourselves to be in front of a camera and how we format our experiences for a camera. So I was already thinking like that, and saw a lot of younger people in public places posing for pictures. And so I'm sort of in this third-party, less accessible, position, right? I'm not in the proper frontal camera position for any of these pictures, and there's quite a few of them. But I think that really gives us a lot of information about, how these people are holding themselves and how, they want their picture to come out. In many cases, because I shoot large format, there was a lot of follow-up. This isn't like I snuck up and captured these people in the wild while they were posing. In many cases, I had to be like, hey, I see you're posing. See this big camera? Can I drag it over and take your picture? And so there's a lot of mannerism that results from this sort of intervention on my part. And I think it comes through in the images because it's hard to hold some of these things for a long time. So you start to see a little bit of that give and that discomfort in some of those images. So these pictures were taken around the time that I first went to Panama City Beach for spring break, which was a weird thing to do. I think every artist at some point in their life has a moment where they're like, you know, aware that they've done something over and over again and they want to break a pattern or they want to try something new. And I sort of gave myself a little challenge with going to spring break. I kind of wanted to do the thing I thought I really wasn't supposed to do. Like, no, it's the most cliche thing you could possibly do. Like, definitely don't do that. I think I had friends who were like, definitely don't do that. But, you know, I was at a point where I wanted to think about my practice and think about the decisions I was making. So I went to spring break. I brought a friend who's somewhere out there. Who was very patient, and I just went to watch and see what was going on. I didn't take all that many pictures, but the things that I noticed when I went down, at that time I was probably 35, which made me easily 15 years older than the people that were there, right? I mean, actually there's quite a range now that, you know, to be honest, it's like, it's all over the place. There's 14-year-olds, there's 28-year-olds, there's people older than me. It's a mysterious place. So I noticed that in 2014, when I was at spring break, that people were doing exactly the same thing that they did in 1993 when I was that age. And I thought it was really remarkable, you know, that I would look around the beach and see groups of teens surrounding a friend who was drinking out of a automatic gun-looking beer holder thing, or shotgunning beers or keg stands or whatever. I mean, there were crowds supporting the friends, there was cheering. It was like a flashback. It was the same thing. Very little felt like different at all. The fashion, maybe, you know. And that really resonated with me. I took a few pictures, and I came back to town and I started going to different outdoor party places around here, not Florida. Florida was well, I went a couple times a year, I guess. Spring break lasts a long time, you see. It's like down there, spring break starts like February 27th and ends like March or April 5th or something. So just when you think you're like, I didn't get that many pictures this year, I don't need to go back, you're like, I could actually go back next weekend. So sometimes that happened where I would go back a lot. But I ended up going to a lot of places locally and bringing people who helped me a lot, but really looking for moments that felt like they were important social moments. It's not an interest in keg stands or shotgunning beers because, oh, isn't that so fascinating that people abuse alcohol and show off in front of their friends? That feels fairly, like we got it, we know, it's out there, you know? But it's primarily out there in a very lo-fi form, right? It's usually taken in context with a disposable camera, in my generation, an iPhone. There's something I'm very interested in that Hita Sterl writes about called the poor image, an image that's ready to circulate, that's copied, that's screen captured. That these activities are not treated photographically as important as they are in these people's lives in that moment, because in that moment there's a lot at stake, I think. I think that social situations can shift if you nail it when you shotgun the beer. You are cooler. Right? If you really mess up, you are not as cool, right? But I didn't see that the photographic documentation treated these things like they were very important. And I don't know that it's a cause-effect, you know, you could sort of reverse the cause-effect a little bit on that, but I found it incongruous with my experience of those things. Because my memory of being that age was that everything mattered, right? You say the cool thing at the party and you're like a rock star. It's done, it's sealed, everything happens fast, it's all very extreme, you know, everything matters. And, you know, the sort of snapshot aesthetic was the opposite of the approach that I thought was appropriate for tackling it. So I'm bringing a very formal photographic approach to these things that I think maybe are over-documented but very underappreciated in some ways. And I'm complicit in this, there's no way that I can take photographs of people drinking and smoking and sexist imagery, like all sorts of things. There's no way I can be a part of this and not be also contributing to that culture. So there's a way in which this is a risky sort of space to occupy, because it's a fine line between when I'm challenging something and when maybe I'm reiterating it. But I'm kind of counting on this idea that by presenting things that require a closer quality of attention, that I'm actually asking you to complicate the things that that we receive and we think of as very simple and very trivial. So that's kind of my my goal when I'm working on these pieces. So what you're seeing in this room are, as I showed you earlier, some of the photographs where I'm photographing someone who's already being photographed. There are also photographs of people in the middle of some sort of ambiguous action, which was on purpose. I'm interested in the ambiguity. I'm not here to educate you guys on what the newest drinking game is or approach it, from an anthropological sort of position. Although I'm interested in some of the ambiguities that exist within that type of documentation. But you'll see, especially on this wall with some black and white works, as well as over here with the guy in the red shirt, there's a few activities that don't really explain themselves. Maybe they're a game, maybe they're right after something happened, and I'm okay with leaving it there. The desire for you to know might be enough of that close quality of attention that I'm interested in, because I think that these might be moments that we don't contemplate long enough. There are some pictures that fall a little more towards reenactment. So, in this sort of of course in photography there's genres and there's people who do things really, really well, like Jeff Wall, sees something, remakes it later. But there's certainly that happening as well, like with the rope picture, making reference to hazing rituals, but those are not the people directly affected by those hazing rituals. Those are people who are just in the vicinity of those things. So there are a little bit of, gestures towards reenactment in a few of the images, but it sort of spans the whole gamut between extremely controlled and more of a documentary approach. There isn't one way that I'm tackling this, because I think these things require different treatment. This image, for instance, is probably, I was trying to think about it when I was walking around earlier, because the documentary question is always, it's like, if you've already admitted, you're like, I'm going to ask you if they're documentary. It's always on someone's mind. And I was thinking about it, and I'm like, I'm pretty sure that picture is probably the most straight documentary. I mean, this was a guy I'd never met before. He'd never met me. He was flirting with my friend, who's not here. And so he was kind of hanging out with us long enough for me to focus the camera on him and be like, hey man, I'm taking these pictures. Can I take your picture? He was really distracted by my friend. At some point behind me, his friends started, I think, just partying. And maybe they were drinking his beer or something was happening, and it was really starting to stress him out. And I'm still being really slow with my camera, and I'm like, I'm still gonna do this, cool? And he's like, yeah. And I'm just like there when he got anxious. I was just there, So in this way, I didn't say like, can you turn your head this way? Can you catch the light if you do that? Can you look sad? That didn't happen here, but it happens all the time. And I'm not really very fazed by those lines between what is staged and what is controlled, as long as the picture works. And I think I'm looking for a certain amount of earnestness and a certain amount of genuineness. And if that happens, that's great. I think people sometimes use the word stage like it's, a bad word. And I think that stage ultimately implies that you know the result of the image before you take it, which is certainly not the case with the work I make. I have no idea. I'm like out in really weird places that I stand out like a sore thumb. Definitely since I started letting my hair get grayer, I stand out like a sore thumb, and they ma'am me a lot. Like, ma'am, and I'm like, you know, so there's a lot of control in some of these images, and it's hugely important to the concept. But sometimes it happens the other way a little bit. Sometimes there's a mix. So, you know, I've sort of spoken about these images. You know, this young man shotgunning the beer. You know, I have 20 portraits like this, and this is a very like photographer's dilemma, right? You take something over and over again, but you're not necessarily interested in a typology. You just know you're looking for something and you haven't found it yet. And this one I took and I was like, oh, it's totally it. It's that guy. Because he was so into it. He was just really loving that beer. And so much so, or you know, whatever, that his elbow dropped just enough so that a woman's hand came in and helped him just a little bit with leverage, which I thought was really quite poignant and wonderful, because his tattoo that says strength, well, his tattoo says strength, I'll just leave it there. You know, so it's just kind of, I just think it's beautiful, and I think, you know, there's a moment there that's very real, and so I think that picture ended up being, you know, the one that got to be more complicated than the others. As far as, you know, sort of walking a little bit around the room, the pictures, I might, can I do this? Can I just go over here? Okay. The pictures on this wall are a bit different. And, you know, the hanging of the show was done with a lot of awareness. Someone said something later like, oh, that's the beach wall. And I was like, how did I not see that? I guess that is the beach wall. You know, but for me it was different. It was much more about how they were posing and what they were thinking about. But I was trying, you know, I'm very aware that like in 1993, shotgunning and keg stands, this was run-of-the-mill stuff. But in 2016, most of the people who are doing that are doing it with a sense of cultural irony, you know. It's kind of like dressing up for something for Halloween and thinking that it is, you know, dumb, but you actually are like absolutely trying to look cool. You know, same thing with keg stands or tying cherry stems in a knot in your mouth. You're performing a little bit, even though it might be seen as trivial. So I was trying to think hard about what in 2016 would be a similar type of social performance. And of course, selfie culture is massively important, and it incorporates young artists and their work, which is fascinating to me. So it rides sort of an interesting line between, you know, more pop culture and then sort of a unique place for artists to have space. So I basically was lucky enough through my WAP assistant, who's here. My thank you list is in here. I spaced out, so I'm going to have to do it after. I met a lot of young people, which is another question that comes up a lot, like how did I meet these people? You know, and it happened in 10 different ways. Like one way was I'm just not that shy, so I like walked up to people. That's one of the main ways. The other way was that I ended up part of this program. I mean, this program is incredible, right? It's like a fantasy for an artist, because they're like, you get to have a show, you get to have a year to think about it, you get to have enough money so that you can make something happen that you've never thought could happen before. And then the best of all, you get help, which is like, I mean, I've like, my friendships don't have to be as taxed anymore. Like, I don't have to like beg people to help me out. You know, it was amazing. So I got so lucky, and I got to work with 3 young women who all went completely out of their way to find different groups of people for me to photograph. And in some cases they knew them, in some cases they didn't. In some cases it was like a joint effort where we would kind of like get weird and look on Instagram a lot. My students I don't typically photograph, but they kind of like moved in and out of being helpful and really awesome and supportive. So anyway, these particular photographs here are a portrait, they're portraits. And I mean, you're kind of in a portrait show right now too. You know, the edit for the show could have leaned towards actions, could have leaned towards landscapes and scenes and things, but it ended up being that the portraits, I think, were the strongest. So this is a portrait, this is two people who went to the same party, and this is a portrait of a young man right before the party started, and of a young woman right as the party was ending. And I thought it was kind of a nice way to talk about all of the complexities that happened in between, all of the crazy question marks and maybe debaucherous things that could have happened through these really quiet photographs. So, you know, when I moved into being interested in the selfie culture, I basically, through my assistants, met these young artists who part of their daily practice was to photograph themselves, right? Like, so every day, this is Micah, every day Micah photographs herself, right? It's something that she's going to do anyway. And I got to go with my 4x5, right? So none of the inventiveness and ingenuity that you see in this image has anything to do with me. I'm not smart enough to say, take your pants off and do this. Like, this is this person, right? Like, I'm there and I'm lucky enough to have a camera that lets me shift out of the way so I'm not blocking the mirror, but I'm just there making a very formal version of what Micah is making on a cell phone, right? Same thing with the image as you walk in. That's Micah's composition, that's Micah's idea. But, you know, I'm inserting a certain amount of, again, like attention to detail, if you will. I feel like I keep saying that. So I think, you know, we can talk about, I want to talk about these middle pictures and maybe skip, I would put these in the selfie conversation here. There's certainly a lot of questions about this image of the woman with a wet t-shirt, so I can talk about that a little bit. I got really focused on wet t-shirt contests. I don't really know how it started, except that I was reading some statistics later. After I had become obsessed with them, I read some statistics that said between 93 and 97, that was the height of the wet t-shirt contest in America. So, and I was like, well, okay, so that was for me age 12 to 18. And that makes a lot of sense. That's kind of when you're really receiving a lot of information and paying attention to things and becoming a woman, so I'm paying attention to wet t-shirt contests. So it also felt like very hard to touch, like, don't go there. You're only gonna make pictures that are furthering a problem with the objectification and the representation of women. How could you possibly want to pick a subject more taboo and more difficult? Don't do it. That was advice I didn't take. But, you know, I photographed at the contests and it was super boring, and it was the pictures that you would imagine from MTV or Girls Gone Wild or something like that. But I wanted a photograph that addressed what I sensed when I was there, which was a real complexity, because a lot of the women had a very important sense of agency at different moments during these events. And you can't sum it up with a picture that is raunchy and say that that's all that these contests are. They're more complicated than that. There's some hope, and there's some vulnerability, and there's some anxiety, and there's something at stake, you know, just like these other events. And so I tried for 2 years to make a picture at a wet t-shirt contest that had some of those complexities in it, and I found it extremely difficult. And I can safely say that's the only one. Like, if I ever get really broke, I might wonder what I should do with the thousands and thousands of pictures I have of wet t-shirt contests. Yeah, I hosted one at one point, because I was like, I know the trick is that I'll have a feminist wet t-shirt contest. I'll control all of the elements. It will be only women, performing for women. That's it. This will solve it. I will get that picture. And then I got them, and I was like, no. So, you know, and this is someone who, it's after the contest, right? It's way after. And, for me, the photograph is being carried on that like really tiny sliver of time, like that decisive moment. It's so dorky to throw that out, but like that we get excited about as photographers, where she's sharing with us a lot of vulnerability and a lot of anxiety, and she's also, being represented in this sort of like beautiful light and in this very domestic setting. So for me, I think it started, it does not complete, but it at least starts a conversation on how these things that are typically represented as being only one thing in only one way can actually be far more complicated. So that's sort of how that got here, and I did spend a lot of time wrestling with that subject matter and not getting very far. There are some photographs of scenes in this show as well. I didn't want them to be big, huge, intense pictures. I felt really strongly about the scale of all of the portraits in the room. In fact, each one of these wanted to be a different size, which totally costs more money, by the way. Like when you're printing and framing things, you should be aware of that. But they all wanted to be slightly different sizes and shapes, not necessarily depending on scale, just on how loud or quiet that made them, or how aggressive that made them, how much you wanted to approach them or walk into them and be inside them. But these pictures of scenes were different. They're fairly self-explanatory. I've referred to them as studies, mainly because they were never intended when I shot them to be a part of this, final project. I kind of shot them thinking, I think I said this to my assistants that I was working with, I was like, I don't know about this. Let's just go make these pictures, but yeah, I don't know. Like, let's just study it for a minute. I don't know, So I kind of approached a lot of these group pictures with a little bit of uncertainty. And when the show was coming together, I realized that I really wanted there to be a little bit of environment and a little bit of action. So that's sort of where these come from. The picture that is most important to me that's up there is on the far right. Can I just keep moving, or is that weird? I just keep moving. Is this picture on the far right, where, there's a lot of, this complicity that I was making reference to earlier, this idea that, in photography, that there's an invisible photographer that somehow navigated a scene and got in there and got the shot, and didn't impact the scene is just so ridiculous. I impacted every one of these photographs dramatically by being there. I was not only older, I was with an enormous camera, I often had an assistant, and I'm super slow. Like, I am not a fast human being. Like, I move slow, I kind of think slow. I don't know how the people I photograph feel about that, but I kind of, go at my own pace. So in this particular situation, these people absolutely knew that I was there to take their picture, and they were kind of like, okay, she wants a picture of a keg stand, so we'll just keep doing this keg stand thing. But then there's one woman who's like calling me out. She's just like staring right at me, direct eye contact, while her friends are doing something. She's kind of on the outside, and it's enough for me to think it's a really complicated picture, because she's just, acknowledging that I'm in her space, I'm in their space, their social space, and that's part of the read of this image, and it has to be. It doesn't always have to be this overt, but it's there, right? That complicity again. So I think the last pictures to talk about are these middle images, which are double-sided. So you probably noticed. So these were, I guess these were like kind of close in that documentary family that we were talking about earlier, but there was a lot of awareness that I would be there at this place making these photographs, so that changes things. But it's essentially a group of people in Athens who went to a party that I wasn't at. I was there to be on a photo panel. Yeah, you guys were all there. And I just capitalized on the fact that I was in Athens, and I think one of my students maybe was like, FYI, there's a lot of hungover people that are waking up at this weird neighborhood with multicolored houses. And of course, that's really all you had to say to me for me to be like, I'll be there. And so I showed up early in the morning, and as these people were sort of hanging out and leaving their home, I photographed them. It was one of those things where like a lot of people fell asleep at one house, you know, because that's what you do after a party, because the house is there, so you fall asleep, and then you wake up, and then you're in the same clothes, and it's funny, but it's intimate, and it's your community, and it's kind of wonderful. You don't usually have multicolored houses, but in Athens, they had multicolored houses. But what was really important to me, actually when I got the film back, I was like, nah, like, it's another typology. Like, I'm not a typology person, really. I don't care to, same thing 12 times. Like, that's just not something I get that excited about. But I got really interested in the fact that day, mainly because I wasn't planning this. I don't remember, or I didn't plan well. I only brought like 20 sheets of film, and for a large format photographer, that's like, that's either 10 shots where you give yourself a little bit of leeway and photograph everything twice, or you could photograph 20 things, but I decided to photograph 10 people and use 2 sheets on each, which is super dorky to tell you guys, but the reason it's relevant is that it produced 2 negatives. So for each kid, I have 2 shots, and when I was looking at them months later, because my first reaction to them was that they were kind of very straightforward and they didn't move me in any way, but when I looked at them in the sets, I was really struck by how complex these young people were, that in the 10 seconds between me taking the first and second shot, they could change, and they could look like they were having an entirely different experience or were a different person. Some they didn't. I mean, this young man looks almost the same, but this young woman is crying in one and extremely stoic in another, right? But this is a matter of seconds, and coaching, sure, like turn your head this way, but not start crying now, nothing like that. So there's sort of a tension there for me, and I struggled a lot with how to present them, because I wasn't really interested in the diptych, the like, but I thought it would be really relevant to create a situation in which maybe a viewer questioned themselves for a minute, just a second, even if you just like walk by it and you're like, I thought it looked different, and then you came back, and that would be my intention, is to create a little bit of sort of that suspension, I think, of time with the pictures. They're as much about fashion as they are about people, right? Because there's so much going on in that way. And I didn't have anything to do with that. So there are 10 of these, and if I get a chance one day, I'll try to make 10 of these things. And it was a real challenge. Some of the people I have to thank in my book are people who went so out of their way, including Derek, who's somewhere, went so out of their way to help me figure out how you make a photograph do that, because I'm a real photographer who doesn't know how to do anything other than take pictures. So this was really exciting too, and this was a perfect space for it, and MOCA was really, really like all for it. Go for it, we'll figure it out. So I think that's a general overview of everything. I didn't dive too deep into one thing or another, so I thought questions might help, because you might have a question about anything. Or not, yeah.
How do you think, so your perception of your work, how do you think your subject changed in your thought process of you working with a large format versus,
Thank you.
that brought how do you think that changed the relationship between you and the
The question is, how does the large format camera change my interaction with the subject, maybe?
Well, or how do you perceive how they saw you?
Oh, well, it does a few things that are really helpful, and it does a few things that are really annoying. One that's very helpful is that a lot of people don't know what it is or does. So one of the first reactions is like, am I going to get a tintype? And I'm like, no, definitely not going to get a tintype, because I think like at holiday places, they use 4x5s to give people tintypes. Okay. But there's curiosity about it, which works to my advantage, right? Because the immediate reaction, I think, to a person with a camera is that exploitative relationship of like, oh, you want to take something from me, you want something from me. And this camera is so passive. I mean, like, not only do I need permission, I need to be like, hold still for a long time while I get ready. You know, it's like, there's no one being photographed that doesn't want to be photographed because of that level of permission. So I think they may have thought I was more serious because of it. I'm not your average, like, I like to take pictures. It's like, no, that girl's carrying this like weird 60-pound box around and taking forever, and maybe it lent to some of the seriousness. But I was also really clear about what I wanted, because I couldn't afford, unfortunately, I couldn't afford to take pictures of just stuff, because the film is about $10 a shot. That's on the low end, you know? So if you kind of like something, you kind of pull out your digital camera and maybe think about taking it with that. But I am so not trained to use my digital camera that I honestly, I would forget that I would do whole shoots, and I would come back and my assistants would be like, let's see the digital. And I'm like, you're gonna get mad. I forgot again, you know, and it's like, I'm just not programmed to use it. So I don't know if I answered, did I answer it okay? I think it really changes the interaction. For me, the most important part of using it comes from the fact that it demands that people give things a closer quality of attention. Yeah. So, yeah. Hi.
So I'm curious to know if you took in back to this, because everything seems to be in daytime, you know, that's really, I have really like one day. So I'm wondering if you have any back to that, so you can edit it and see
That's a really interesting question. There's one. The question was, do I have any pictures at nighttime? And I really, in this show, I only have one, which is this young woman with a pink coat, I think. A lot are at like 7, you know, but okay. Good question. So the camera, when you shoot it at night, requires artificial light. And you create a real scene with your strobes, and it just didn't feel right. But I have a lot of pictures at night with digital cameras, and I was really photographing a lot at night. So that's the weird thing about being a photographer. You just have so much to work with. Like, I don't know, maybe I should have a night show. You know, they're really different because people are usually wasted. And maybe that's also my hesitation, you know, a little bit, but I kind of still use the digital camera a lot like the 4x5 in that I ask a lot of permission. I'm slow, even though it's a fast camera, you know, so there's still sort of that relationship. I have a lot of pictures from after weird parties, like after foam parties, after paint parties. They throw paint, they throw foam, after soapy parties, and those are interesting, but no pictures of like just dance like crazy stuff. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, wondered if anyone would notice that there was no night stuff. So.
So I'm curious about what your relationship is with meaning, as far as like what you're looking for. Maybe like what you're looking for aesthetically, but also what you're looking for meaning-wise, and maybe in a linear way or a non-linear way.
Do you mean with the edit of the show or with the individual? Right. Yeah. Well, I guess I'm very hyper aware and very allergic to the existing documentation. I don't think, I have not recently seen a picture of someone shotgunning taken organically in that community, circulating among friends, that felt like it made me want to contemplate the seriousness of it. So one thing that I'm doing every time I take a picture is think a lot about how to distill what's happening enough so that we can see sort of past some of the maybe familiar posturing. I mean, there's still a lot of posturing. Like, I think some of the mannerism is that the 4x5 generates sort of echoes the posturing of normal social behavior a little bit. But I don't know if that totally answers your question, the meaning. Well, I like it because you're talking about what I'm looking for when I'm taking a picture. I don't know. I'm also really interested in being super surprised by what I get. I did not think, for sure, the first time I went to Panama City, I thought I would just change a little and not be so myself, but I was so myself and approached things so slowly and so formally. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe that answered it. Yeah.
The only thing you've got thousands of images that you became, I assume, incredibly emotionally connected to over this whole project. What were some of the editing, your editing tools that you used that ultimately were the most meaningful?
That is such a good question. Are you a photographer too, or do you photo? Okay, well, I ask because it's so hard, and I think that other people just don't understand us, photographers, because it's so hard to edit. And I got weird, man. I got really weird. Like, I made tiny, tiny prints, tons of them. I flew to different cities with them in my bag, and I would pull them out in inappropriate places and have friends make piles with me, put them back together, photograph the piles, go to another city, do it again. I couldn't wrap my mind around the quantity and how many different ways the show could be. And this edit resulted because I had an epiphany about how hard this you know, like there are so many directions. I just want it to be one that I'm very excited to see right now, and there can be other ones later. And that kind of worked. And I was like, I want to see what the portraits do together. Because, like, you know, Alessandra brought this up once, like, that, because we were playing with some language from the Breakfast Club, but that I'm putting all these people in a room who don't know each other, who've never met, a lot of them, and, you know, trying to hang them like they're almost here with us in the room. And that edit started to make sense. Well, then who do I want to be in the room together? What happens when, you know, the guy with the orange shirt is in the same room with, you know, the guy with the rat and no shirt? You know, those sorts of tensions started to interest me. Or there's a hand coming into the frame over there, there's a hand coming into the frame over there, you know. These sorts of relationships started to build slowly, but it was like not pretty. I was just like, and like I would accost people. I'd be like, people I didn't know that well, I'd be like, which one? You know, and they'd be like, and so I learned that I could be more graceful next time. But I was weird for sure, and I have a lot of other like edits that I'm super excited about that just couldn't be this time, you know. So, yeah. Yeah.
Has so much to do with a period of life where there's this sense, right, that like the malleability of the way you present yourself is closing down.
Right.
And becoming more focused. That like an identity that at one time might have been a lot of open doors, that like those doors are starting to close, you're starting to find out who you are through these rituals. And you were saying that you feel like it's interesting how most people are doing the same thing that they would have been doing back then. One of the things I'm kind of bored, I got You know, like, I don't know how it's, but I mean, I recognize them too, right? And so I wonder if like, one of the things that's really different between then and now is how accustomed this group of late adolescents are to mediate their identity and photographies without the world.
Yeah.
And I feel like at times in this work, I see that reflected. And to maybe become an editing question, I wonder if like there's something that you're looking for in the selection of these images that responds to a sense of awareness about that makes it different from the spring breakers of 95.
Right, the self-consciousness. I mean, well, I don't know, but maybe you're touching a little bit on this generation's relationship to self-presentation is just so very, very, very different. I mean, there's feedback. We may have all photographed ourselves. There was no feedback. Like, there's tons of drawers of me doing weird stuff that no one will ever see because it was a disposable camera until you discover it, yeah. So I think that circulation and the potential for celebrity, which never existed or didn't feel like it existed, is something really unique to this generation. And I think that I'm thinking about it in terms of the edit, and I don't know if that was part of the conscious decision making, but it really, really was part of the decision making this year when, I don't know if everyone knows this, but Panama City went through something fairly substantial last year where public drinking was banned because they had so many horrible things happen on the beach in public. People were raped in public, there were murders, there's a lot of illegal activity. So the entire city, the entire county, I think, made drinking illegal. So when I went back the last time, it was a completely different city. Things were so much more calm. And I noticed that year more than ever that I was very sensitive to the yeses and nos, the people who said, yeah, you can take my picture, whatever, and people were like, no. And I was like, oh, this is really interesting. Like, I think that I'm something about the people who didn't come this year were the people who always said yes. And they always wanted to be photographed, and they always wanted me to immediately text them the photograph. I was like, well, I can actually make you this big one and send it, and they're like, no, what would I want with that? It's like, I wanted to, and I'm like, okay. So it was an interesting shift and a shyness that happened, and it was not a debaucherous year. It was a family-friendly year. Yeah, I mean, that's the only picture, am I right about that? That's the only picture I got from last year, was that one. And he was drinking like behind a weird restaurant with his friends. Did I answer that? It was a great question. I'm not sure I did. Okay, sorry, yeah. Okay, so need to consult a historian and sociologist first. No. Okay, well, I think there's really special things about your generation. I can say this because Kaya is in that picture, so I know her generation, right? There's a lot of people here who are in the pictures, which is also really cool that they don't disappear. So there's cool things about your generation, like it's so diverse, like more than ever. There's a strange optimism, like with your generation. And I think that there's a distance from marriage, there's a distance, or a lack of interest in marriage or something. There's a lot of distance from religion and spirituality, which I don't know how that'll play out. But there's a lot of just stuff that I think, and we don't know what's gonna happen. Like, we don't know climate change is definitely a bad thing, but I don't think we know enough about the ways that things will shift for me to know how that will impact that generation. But I do think that you guys are really complicated, and people always try to make you seem really simple. But I actually, especially because I teach that generation and I'm around you guys a lot, I don't know. I don't really have a good answer for that at all, but I think it's an interesting question. Yes, that was digital. How'd you know? Yeah. Well, no, it was, I shot it 4x5 too, and there were a few pictures that didn't make it. You know, the large format cameras, like, you know, I'm glad I shot a backup digital of it, but it's not the same. But I have it in 4x5 if I want to invest a lot of time in repairing some damage. But yeah, it is digital. A couple are. Yes. Well, so when I say something's at stake, I'm thinking about social hierarchies, and the fact that, like, you could like trip and fall in school, and then your social status has changed. Now you're a dork or a loser, or you could date the right person, and now you're the coolest person ever. Like, that the social status changes are so rapid and extreme at that age. But I also see the same thing echoing in image quality that I talked about earlier, that the poorer the image, right, the more it is the proletariat of images. Like, it's something that circulates and has a strange kind of power, but it's not seen in a class system as being on top, right? Whereas images like this might be in a different conversation on a hierarchy of images, the same way that sort of, you know, different acts and different social strata that change and move through these things. I think that they echo one another. And I think that what's at stake is the same conversation, right? Because I think 2016 or 1993 or whatever, the same exact moment could come and go and be incredibly traumatic or totally euphoric based on the circumstances. I just don't, I think there's so much, there's like a lot of relative experience of trauma like that, you know, one person being traumatized forever about it and one person getting over it and moving on and being very well adjusted. But I don't know if the difference between those two time frames is like something that I'm an expert enough to understand. I think it's just always there. Like, everyone all the time navigates these moments of being vulnerable, feeling alienated, feeling like they're in charge and on top, or like they're a big loser. But what's weird is that we think, or what I think is weird is that photography can really seal someone's identity into sort of a pattern of it being considered raunchy or bad or in poor taste or low culture if it's photographed a certain way. I think there's potential for that. I don't know. Did that answer the question? I might be malfunctioning. Yeah. It's great.
So, like, have you been waiting 20 years to make these photographs? Take these photographs?
How did you know that? I didn't tell you that. You didn't know. Yeah, totally. I've wanted to take these for 20 years, yeah.
For that long?
I mean, I did too. Like, I have versions of this from when I was younger. But it's always on the list of, like, you probably shouldn't photograph this list.
Because it's too autobiographical, or?
I don't know if it's autobiographical in the way that, like, I remember being traumatized by a keg stand. It's more like, it's absolutely fascinating that keg stands put so much strain on your body. You feel like you're choking. There's something weird and sexual about it. You're upside down. You're relying on your friends to carry you. It's very weird and intense and extreme, and everyone's like, oh, ha, 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 just did a keg stand. And I'm like, no, I'm traumatized by that. That was intense and crazy and violent. And that there's always felt to me, photographs or not, like there's a misunderstanding of how incredibly weird that is. So I think I've been thinking about that for a long time.
And so do you think that this edit, right, so you potentially have all these edits in this work, and it sounds like from your description that you edit out some of the extremes. And I guess I'm wondering if this edit that is the portraiture edit is also the edit that's more about photography than the other edits?
That's interesting. More about photography. I think the portraits, especially the portraits, more than the scenes, might be more about fidelity and formalism in photography. So yeah. Good question. Any more? Oh, is that a question? Oh, okay. Oh, there's two. Yeah. And they just wanted to be black and white. I was surprised too. I was like, oh, they're going to be black and white. I wish there was a deeper reason. No, yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about what you were doing before this project? What led up to this? I know you did a series on romance.
Yeah.
And you took those two photographs kind of first. What were the in-between things? How did you get here?
Well, I've literally always done the same thing, which is take more serious pictures of things that aren't that serious. Why are you laughing? So it's kind of I applied it to romance, I applied it to this, but in between, oh, you mean blunt rolling contests and things like that?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, I went to blunt rolling contests, and I went to cherry stem rolling contests, and I started small and just interested in these contests that were happening in social situations with different groups of people. But it ultimately led. I photograph people, so I kind of just went back there. But yeah. But thanks everyone. I really want to, yeah, okay. Can I just thank? Okay, thanks.